a little bit of history. So a very brief history of siding here, touching on only the big stuff and going back to relatively modern times still. When we started to look at siding, it becomes real clear real quickly that builders in the 18th and 19th century obviously didn't have the luxury of all of today's construction tools and technology, but they still managed to build houses that last to this day. One of the reasons they were able to do that was because they were using pretty durable and pretty long-lasting materials, including siding. Siding material through about 1900, so a little more than 100 years ago, primarily consisted of stone, brick, and wood. Stone was a popular material because it was readily available, it was actually cheap, and obviously it's very durable. Brick was a more expensive material, but easy to manufacture with clay and a kiln. And then wood was obviously also a go-to choice for builders because trees were readily available at that point in time. If you go back and look at houses built 100 years ago, you will find they're primarily brick and wood clad. This is especially true of a lot of craftsmen or arts and crafts style houses, which if you've been in our CE classes, you'll know that's one of my, if not my favorite style of all time. But if you look at a picture of a house built roughly 100 years ago, it has both a brick and a wood sided exterior. So those were far and away the two most common siding materials until actually about the mid 20th century. Brick itself is positively ancient, with the earliest known brick structure dating to about 7000 BC in what today is Turkey. And it was made of very coarsely crafted blocks of clay that were accidentally left in the sun and dried out and formed, well, kind of what we would think of as adobe bricks today. The ancient Egyptians, if you know your world history, made bricks by mixing clay with straw. Aztecs had a similar method as well. Lots of different ancient civilizations throughout the world had methodologies for making bricks. You can actually find paintings on tomb walls in Thebes and in other parts of Egypt portraying Egyptian slaves mixing, tempering, and carrying clay for making sun-dried bricks. Bricks were manufactured using the sun until about 3000 BC, when the Romans actually began firing those clay bricks in earthen kilns, which greatly increases the structural integrity of the brick and causing a prehistoric, well, I guess not prehistoric, but brick building boom of ancient times. And they were then used to build structures throughout the Mediterranean and Baltic regions, eventually spreading to Europe and eventually spreading here. But fired clay bricks, which is what we still use today, are a material that dates back, oh gosh, probably roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years at this point in time. They have the popularity of brick has waxed and waned over the years. It became much less popular during the Renaissance, but it did cross over here to the New World with Dutch and British immigrants as early as the 14 and 1500s, although the earliest brick buildings we can find here date to the early 1600s, 1611 in Virginia. And then finally by the mid 18th, gosh, I can't talk today, by the mid 18th century, bricks started making a comeback, but were still basically being made and fired by hand at that point in time. So it was a complex and slow moving process. Builders needed a cheaper, easier, and more accessible material. And they got that in the form of stone and wood. And we'll circle back to bricks here in a second. So the 1800s bring us much more accessible stone and wood siding. Stone is obviously also an ancient building material. Parts of the Roman Colosseum, parts of the Egyptian pyramids are made with stone, but modern stone siding actually first appeared by the mid to late 1800s here, mostly in the interior of buildings as a decorative material. And it doesn't become a really popular outside siding material until the 1940s, when technology made stone easier to transport and manufacture, and we began to get thin stone veneers that we know today in the building industry. Up until that point in time, stone as a siding material was basically a reflection of stone as a construction material, when we would use literal actual solid stones to build walls and houses and things like that with. But since the mid 1940s, stone veneer has been a popular choice for builders because of its durability and longevity. Wood siding has been around for hundreds of years in log cabins, Georgian style mansions, all kinds of different housing materials, but it too experienced a renaissance. So think of it as moving from log cabins to colonial houses to mass produced wood siding. And it was because brick was expensive to transport and move around. So early builders here turned heavily to wood because trees were almost always readily available near their building locations. And it was relatively easy to mill that into wood siding. So, our earliest houses here, think log cabin, but then shortly after that, wood siding came along because those trees were readily available. So once we had milling facilities available, wood siding really kind of started to take over. And then brick makes a comeback after that because finally brick making machinery was created during the Industrial Revolution. There was plenty of clay available to make bricks from, and all of a sudden brick could actually be mass produced by machine, making it a popular building material again by about the mid 1800s. So because trends are circular and thanks to the simplified brick making process and wood milling process, houses made of brick and wood are the predominant style we have here in the US, starting in colonial times, and then really getting a good mix of those as we go to the mid to late 1800s. And then it's not until the middle of the 20th century that we actually begin to change siding materials again. In fact, one of the most popular wood siding materials was actually a rustic wood siding that was popular during the Great Depression because it was relatively inexpensive to produce and because of the creation of the Works Progress Administration, which used a ton of it during the Depression as well. So the two predominant materials we had here up until the 20th century are basically brick and wood with a little bit of stone siding thrown in. So let's talk 20th century siding because that's what's going to be really important to us in the real estate profession. So as post-World War II suburbs flourished during the middle of the 20th century, so did options for siding. This is when we first really begin to see aluminum siding, which became available just before the 1950s. Vinyl siding follows about a decade later in the early 1960s and then grows in popularity because manufacturers offer all kinds of color and style options. Plus, the material was actually then considered more durable than aluminum. And then also during this period, there's all kinds of other siding materials like T111, masonite lap siding, oriented strand board LP siding, and then finally the fiber cement siding that's so predominant today. And we are going to go through and we are going to talk about all of these siding materials and some of the pros and cons of them. And I'm going to try and give you guys as much practical information as I can and show you some pictures of what we typically see during the inspection process and the more common defects for us to run across. So let's start kind of at the very beginning here, and we'll talk about the pros and cons of wood siding. So some of the pros of wood siding, and yes, wood siding can still be a thing, but it's not super popular these days. But the pros of it, wood can be stained or painted in limitless colors and finishes, and it comes in all kinds of different profiles as well. It is actually considered an environmentally friendly choice. It doesn't emit pollutants during the manufacturing process. It's wood, so it's obviously biodegradable. It's actually considered a renewable resource. So that makes it an environmentally friendly siding choice. Wood siding is durable enough to last for decades if you maintain it properly. And that's the big if when it comes to wood siding. And there's multiple species of wood that you can choose from: pine, spruce, fir, cedar, redwood, cypress. Although I will caution you guys, these are not the same quality woods that they were 100 years ago, because we are now harvesting most of the wood for siding and for building in general from trees that are essentially farmed. So we're not harvesting that old growth wood anymore. We're harvesting much faster, less disease and rot resistant forms of that wood. So it does require actually increased maintenance. Upgrading to wood siding can add value to your house. It's considered a high-end siding. And it comes in all kinds of different profiles: laps, shingles, shakes, tongue and groove, board and batten, all kinds of different profiles for that siding. So wood is actually not totally outdated as a siding material, but it does have some cons. It will be expensive compared to other siding options, although that is somewhat dependent on the style of siding and the type of wood you select. So just like anything else out there, quality matters when it comes to wood siding. Wood siding requires a fair amount of maintenance. It can be costly and it can be tiring, as it requires frequent cleaning, staining, painting, all of that kind of stuff, because you cannot let water get to it. If it does, it is going to rot. It's a natural material. Wood will eventually develop problems with water. It'll swell, it'll warp, it can crack or check, it can rot, especially if you don't take care of it. And eventually you will have to repair or replace sections of it. And then on top of that, wood obviously burns. So a lot of different types of wood sidings have relatively poor flame spread ratings associated with them as well. So wood siding, from an inspector point of view, remained a pretty popular option for houses, and then kind of ironically for high-end houses through, I'm going to say, about the 1980s. When we see wood siding on houses, the problems we as inspectors generally see with it, well, oftentimes it looks something like this. It hasn't been maintained. It hasn't been regularly cleaned, caulked, painted, or sealed. So the finish is coming off on it. And when the finish on that wood siding starts to come off or deteriorate, water starts to get to that wood. So here it's soaking into that wood siding. It's causing the beginnings of rot problems with it. And you can see where it just hasn't been well maintained. Even well-maintained wood siding over the years will eventually absorb water. And like we talked about, it can crack, it can check, it can split. So this is pretty common for us to see actually on fancy houses over here on Geist, where it's got 1980s wood siding on it that's kind of at the end of its life, where water has gotten to it and it's time for those siding boards to be replaced. But the way to think about wood siding is the problems we usually see with it now are mostly water related, and it's caused that siding to deteriorate over the years. That's what we usually see during an inspection. So let's move from wood to brick and stone. And mainly what we are talking about these days and in this part of the world is brick and stone veneer. We do still see complete masonry houses where it is literally built of brick, but those are, especially as we move into newer construction, much less common than houses with a brick veneer. So the way to think about a brick veneer is it is a layer of brick, basically one brick deep, that acts as a sheathing or a siding on a wood framed house. That is both good and bad. It's a durable material, but it presents its own set of challenges. So if we look at the pros of a brick and stone, whether it's a solid masonry or a veneer, it's a low maintenance product and it is highly durable. If it is a veneer product, there's actually a cavity between that brick veneer and the house itself that acts as an insulating layer and actually keeps our houses a little warmer in the winter and a little cooler in the summer. Bricks are actually highly energy efficient with double the heat capacity of wood. So they alone are a good insulator. Plus that gap also adds to the insulating characteristics of that brick veneer. And a brick veneer home itself is significantly less expensive to construct than a full brick masonry house where the entire wall is made of brick. So it's about 30 to 45% less just for the brick veneer. So a brick veneer allows for a full brick aesthetic at a fraction of the cost of a solid brick house. Like all building materials, though, there are cons to brick as a siding as well. Its cost is much higher than wood, higher than fiber cement, higher than vinyl, because it is a rigid material. Cracking due to the house settling or some kind of shock or impact hitting that brick is fairly common. If your house is wood framed, and around here they all are, you still are going to face the usual threats from fire, pests, rot, moisture intrusion, other natural damages, because the house is not actually made of brick. It's just got brick veneer as a siding. And poorly sealed brick veneer or poorly installed brick veneer will absorb moisture and can lead to structural damage. And that has historically been a problem here in Indianapolis with a couple builders, most notably Trinity, which is who actually built my house. And we got a heck of a deal on it because they were going through those problems when this house was built. But you have to be careful with brick veneer because it will absorb water, so you have to give that some place to drain away. And brick veneer is also going to require some additional maintenance. You have to regularly repair those cracks. You have to inspect and unclog weep holes. You have to check the joints where it meets other siding materials on the house, things like that. Where we typically see problems with brick, it will look like this, where the brick has absorbed moisture and is spalling and deteriorating because of freeze-thaw cycles, or where the house has settled a little bit, causing that rigid brick veneer to crack and need to be tuck pointed or repaired. So those are the two pretty typical brick problems we see. If it's not tied correctly to the house, we can see the wall bowing and moving, but these two are what we typically see with brick veneer. And while we are talking about brick, let's also talk real quickly about weep holes. Remember, brick is a great shield against most of the elements, but it is porous and it will absorb moisture, making it susceptible to leaks. So newer brick veneer homes usually had a set of weep holes at the bottom of the wall that kind of line the base of the cavity and allow any moisture that gets through that brick to kind of trickle down the backside of it and then escape through those weep holes at the bottom of the house. Keep in mind that these have only really been required here in central Indiana since about 2010, depending on where you live, and that no matter what your inspector says in that inspection report, you should not add weep holes to a brick veneer wall that was designed without them, because brick veneer walls can be built without weep holes. So you will find a lot of inspectors that see a brick veneer wall without weep holes, and they'll just automatically say it has to have them. It doesn't. It depends on how that wall was built. So if it was built without weep holes, do not add them because they will actually let moisture and pests into that wall. And remember, they were really only required in most areas around here since about 2010. Okay, other siding materials, aluminum siding, which I used to hate, but now I kind of actually like again. Aluminum has some serious pros to it. It is rot and pest proof. It's impervious to insects and other pests. It's not damaged by mold, mildew, rot, things like that. It is weather resistant. It does not expand and contract as much as vinyl, and it doesn't crack and turn brittle with age. You can actually fairly successfully paint aluminum siding if you do the proper prep work to it. And it comes in lots of different colors as well. It's actually a good insulator because it comes in various gauges, and the heavier gauges of aluminum are better insulators. It's lightweight and easy to install, so its installation costs tend to be lower, and it is a completely recyclable product because it's made of aluminum, so it is actually a very green building material. Downsides to aluminum, it's easy to dent and scratch because it's made of soft aluminum. You can install thicker panels to make it more impact resistant. Colors will fade over time. That factory finish will fade and become chalky, but it can be painted. It generally needs to be repainted or recoated every 10 years after that initial paint coat to keep it looking good. And it can be noisy when it expands and contracts because it will ping, kind of like the noise a car motor makes when it's cooling down. So it's not a perfect material, and it has been supplanted by more modern materials, but all in all, aluminum siding is actually a pretty decent product. The problems with it that we usually see, well, they look something like this. It's been damaged by a hailstorm. It's been damaged by a baseball hitting it. It dents relatively easily, and then it shows that damage. But aluminum siding overall, pretty good material. And having lived in a house now for 17, 18 years with vinyl siding, I would actually go back to aluminum if those were my two options. And vinyl siding is our next material. Vinyl siding was, gosh, it dominated the siding market for decades, and it does have a lot of pros to it. Vinyl siding is inexpensive and will almost always be your cheapest home siding option. Comparable fiber cement is going to easily cost twice as much. Vinyl siding is easy to install, just requires a few hand tools. It is durable. It's constructed out of a PVC, so the same thing we make piping out of. It doesn't warp, rot, chip. It doesn't really dent like aluminum does. It does not need to be painted. That color is homogeneous and runs all the way through it. It is relatively low maintenance. It has a pretty slick surface to it. So dust, cobwebs, other debris cleans off easily with just a garden hose. And it comes in an overwhelming number of colors and styles. There are obviously some cons with vinyl siding, as anybody that's ever lived in a vinyl sided house can tell you. Its installation is simple, but it's not foolproof. And if you install it improperly, it will shrink, it will gap, it'll expand and warp, it can crack and bulge and have other problems. So it seems simple to install, but like everything else in the building world, you have to do it right or you're going to have problems with it. It is a tough material, but it is not impervious to damage. It can split or break due to expansion and contraction. Rocks thrown by lawn equipment can damage it. Hail can obviously damage it. And strictly speaking, it's kind of tough to patch any size hole in vinyl siding, so the entire plank has to be replaced if it's damaged. It does not breathe very well. It's like putting a layer of plastic wrap around your house. So it's typically installed over a styrofoam insulation board, which can trap water behind it. And in addition to that, water can also enter in those gaps and cracks that are created if it's installed correctly. So moisture in walls with vinyl siding tends to be a bit more of a problem than with other materials. It will fade in the sun, and vinyl siding is very difficult to paint properly, and I would actually never recommend it because it will expand, it will contract. The paint doesn't adhere well to plastic. So it's tough to paint it and refresh it and make it look new again. And pressure washing it can be disastrous because you will force water back behind that vinyl siding. When we see problems with vinyl siding, it's typically impact damage like we see here. This is hail damage, but you'll also see kind of similar damage from rocks thrown from lawnmowers, things like that. We will often see heat damage to vinyl siding if somebody places a grill too close to it, or if we say get a reflection off of our neighbor's windows. Some grades of vinyl siding are so cheap and made with recycled materials that literally reflected sunlight can melt it. But it's a relatively soft material and it is heat sensitive. So sagging and melting vinyl siding can actually be a problem as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other problems we see with it are usually due to poor installation more than anything else. So that's vinyl siding. And then finally, let's go to the most common material we see installed on houses these days, and that is fiber cement siding. So fiber cement has a lot of pros to it, but it is not without its cons. The pros, it is a very durable material. It doesn't rot or warp and is relatively crack resistant once it's installed. It resists damage due to UV rays, hail, snow, and ice, and it doesn't attract pests. It's wind resistant. In fact, a lot of local building codes in high wind or tornado type areas actually specify the use of fiber cement siding. It is a long-lived material with an estimated maximum 50 to 75-year service life and usually a pretty good warranty on it. It doesn't burn, essentially, so it has a really good flame spread rating, and it too comes in an overwhelming number of colors and styles. With all those benefits, you might wonder why everything isn't installed in fiber cement siding these days, and a vast majority of houses are, but fiber cement does have some cons to it as well. It is expensive. It's about twice the cost of vinyl or more. Um, it's a little cheaper than brick and synthetic stucco, but not by much. It is not the easiest thing in the world to install. It's heavy. It's about 300 pounds per 100 square feet versus 60 for vinyl. And it requires a pretty experienced crew and some specialized tooling to actually install it correctly. And if you're not careful with it, it will break and crack because it's pretty brittle until it goes onto the house itself. It will absorb moisture, so you actually have to make sure you have a proper clearance between, say, your siding and the roof, something like that. It does not have a really high insulating value, it's about on a par with vinyl, but you can actually get insulated vinyl siding, and it does require maintenance. Even factory paint jobs, which will last about 25 years, will eventually need to be repainted. Um, and most of what's installed for fiber cement siding is not an actual factory paint job for us. It is usually painted on site. And if you've ever seen the way a builder paints siding, it's one pass with a spray gun and that's all you get. And they generally don't do very good prep work. So you are going to have to repaint that fiber cement siding probably after the first 3 or 4 years on new construction, and then roughly every 10 years on houses after that. And it is prone to stress damage. It is a pretty rigid material, so it will crack and chip, especially at the corners or if it is not installed correctly. So the problems we tend to see with fiber cement siding oftentimes look like this. People will crack a board putting it up, they'll crack a corner putting it up because it is such a rigid material. And there is a lot of controversy over the gapping with fiber cement siding. So you are supposed to gap fiber cement siding a bit depending on what time of year you put it up. The colder it is outside, actually the bigger gap you're supposed to leave, because when it warms up, that siding is going to expand a little bit and close that gap. Conversely, the warmer it is outside, the smaller that gap is supposed to be, because when it gets cold, it's going to shrink. You are also, generally speaking, not supposed to caulk those butt joints, because that expansion and contraction will eventually separate that caulk, and that siding needs a little room to breathe and let water vapor escape from the backside of it. So we see improperly gapped fiber cement siding all the time. The rule of thumb there is if we can see the house wrap behind it and read the lettering on the house wrap, it has too much of a gap to it. So anything more than about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch is too big of a gap on that fiber cement siding, depending on what time of year it is. So you'll see that as a common problem as well. It does absorb moisture, so you cannot have it in contact with your roof or other materials that may allow water to wick into it. This is another common problem we see with fiber cement siding. So it has a lot of pluses to it. It also has some minuses to it. Real quick here, as we close in on the end of this presentation, let's talk about some siding materials to avoid. Um, LP siding. LP stands for Louisiana Pacific. They were one manufacturer of this siding, but they were not the only one. But LP siding is basically oriented strand board. It is wood chips and glue, and if you do not install it correctly, water will penetrate the edges, the nail holes, the bottom of this siding, and it will cause it to swell up and delaminate and hold water. I have literally seen mushrooms growing out of LP siding. I do not think it's a good material, although it is still sold today, and they've supposedly fixed the problems with it. I would not put it on my house. Masonite or hardboard siding, made from a mixture of wood fiber and resin. When properly maintained, it's fine, but just like OSB or LP siding, if water starts to get to it, those wood fibers swell up, and then it tends to deteriorate pretty rapidly with swelling, rot, mold problems, things like that. IFIS or synthetic stucco, technically that stands for exterior insulated finish system. That is basically a synthetic stucco around here, usually installed over an insulating panel. That one, believe it or not, there's really not a lot wrong with the product itself, but if you don't install it correctly and water gets behind it, it gets trapped there and causes all kinds of moisture and rot problems. So if you do not install those panels properly, flash them, seal them, caulk them like you're supposed to, you'll have pretty serious moisture problems with an IFIS covered house. And then the last one, which I actually don't consider a problem at all, asbestos cement siding. This actually dates, this is a material that's more than 100 years old, and it is a mixture of asbestos fibers and cement. So think about it as an ancestor to fiber cement siding. It's actually a very durable and fireproof material, although it's even more brittle than fiber cement. The problem with it now is it's considered an environmental hazard, so that when you take it down, you have to worry about asbestos remediation. Left on a house, if it's in good shape, it's a very durable product, and it does add a lot of fire resistance to your house. So those are some sidings to avoid. There are others that are kind of specialty products we don't have time to talk about today. But when we see problems with these materials, well, this is deteriorating LP siding where moisture has gotten to it. You can see it's starting to swell. There's actually a vinyl overlay on it that's starting to bubble, but this is very typical for LP siding deterioration. Here's a hint, if you guys don't know this, LP Louisiana Pacific, the primary manufacturer of this stuff, actually embossed their initials in their wood grain pattern. So there's a knot that you look for in LP siding that you can see. Here's the L and here's the P that actually tells you that this is LP siding. And generally speaking, anything manufactured before 97 is subject to a class action lawsuit and is considered problematic just by its nature. But look for that LP knot, and that'll tell you, if you can find it, whether you have the Louisiana Pacific version of this stuff. Masonite siding, pretty clearly wood fibers and resin or glue. When moisture gets to it, it swells up and deteriorates and starts to fall apart. IFAS or synthetic stucco, if moisture gets to it, it will start to let water get behind it, and it can have cracks or fissures in it that develop like this. It can have chips in it that develop at the edges, all of which can let moisture in. And then finally, asbestos cement siding here, which is a good material, but it's brittle. So if it starts to get damaged like this, it may be time to bite the bullet and replace it. But this is what asbestos cement siding looks like. And you'll see house after house covered with this stuff once you learn what to look for. Let me answer a couple of the questions we got online here real quick, and then we will be finished for this afternoon. But some of the questions we got: is it safe and advisable to paint any type of siding? Well, we talked about this, but some sidings you can paint, some sidings you cannot, specifically vinyl. So let's go ahead and say you can paint most types of siding except for vinyl with the proper prep work and the right type of paint. Are small holes in vinyl siding okay to caulk? Technically, no. You're supposed to patch those with a specialized process or replace the entire plank. Realistically, and I've done this, you can caulk small holes in vinyl siding without too much of a problem. For hardy plank siding, should it be caulked between the boards or should it not be? It should not be caulked between the boards, at least on a modern installation. Acceptable spacing in composite siding, we talked about that, anywhere from a 1/16 to about 1/8 of an inch, and it depends on exterior temperature. How do you keep chipmunks from getting inside your walls between the exterior brick and the foam board behind it on a brick veneer house? The key to that is making sure that you've sealed up any gaps or cracks that are big enough for rodents to get through. And chipmunks, like mice, are very, very flexible. They can get through a hole about the size of your thumb. So it's very common to have a gap where other siding materials meet the brick veneer on your house. That's usually their entry point, so that has to be sealed up. I have seen weep holes made too big where they can get in as well. But the key to keeping rodents out of your house is trying to seal up all those little gaps and cracks that they can get into. In modern construction, let me tell you, it's tough because they are flexible little creatures. This was actually a fascinating question. In our climate, is bamboo siding a good option? Bamboo is really, really new to the market here in the US, and it's not literally putting sheets of bamboo on your house. Bamboo siding is actually made by taking bamboo fibers and compressing them under heat and pressure with a resin, and it actually makes a very durable siding product. It's starting to be used a lot in upper end construction, like in the Pacific Northwest, where it's more easily shipped in from Asia. So I suspect it would be good here, but we haven't seen enough of it to really make that judgment. It's a really intriguing product that I would keep an eye on. Is LP siding still an issue? Yes, LP siding is still an issue. There's lots of it around pre-1997. It's still being sold today. There's other much better materials out there than LP that I would use on a house. Look for delamination, swelling, rot. If it's in good shape and hasn't really started to absorb water yet, you can successfully paint and seal up old LP siding. Otherwise, you're going to have to replace it. Typical lifespan on siding products, depending on what you've got, anywhere from 20 to 75 years. And can you paint asbestos siding? Yes, you can. You just have to be very careful with the prep work because it's asbestos and you don't want to put a lot of those fibers into the air.